Hi, it's John. Welcome back to FinTech Plus. I am pleased to be joined today by a gentleman, Andrew Smart, who's an AI researcher at Google. He was also the author of a book I recently enjoyed called Beyond One or Zero and One. Hi, Andrew. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
I thought I would give you a quick chance. You've had an interesting career. You've actually worked and you've now made it all the way over to Silicon Valley. So I thought I would give you a quick chance to tell us about yourself and your career.
Yeah, right out of high school, and then midway through my art, I realized I was a lot more things than just being a painter, and so I began studying philosophy and linguistics. And then fast forward a while, I wound up in Sweden, and I studied anthropology and philosophy, and then I ended up going to grad school in Sweden for cognitive science, and then I gradually got into more neuroscience questions and studying the brain and more empirical methods like EEG and fMRI studies, and I ended up studying children with attention deficit disorder. And then I went to NYU for a couple years and worked in a brain imaging lab that was studying the neural basis of language. And that was right about the time when machine learning was kind of a new thing, at least in neuroscience, to analyze brain data and kind of try to make, rather than this sort of straightforward testing, people were data mining and pattern recognition, kind of newly available massive amount of brain data that you could generate using these techniques like EEG, MRI. So I started getting familiar with some of the, this was around 2006, 2008. And then I kind of came to a crossroads of like, do I want to, or can I afford to keep trying to become a scientist in academia versus kind of jumping ship and going over into industry? And I had kind of figured out what I wanted to do a bit late in life. So anyway, I chose to go to industry, and I had this opportunity to study, or actually to work at Honeywell Aerospace, using some of the techniques I had been learning about in a neuroscience lab in a more applied setting, like for brain-computer interfaces. And then, so I started working at Honeywell Aerospace, and through that, I got kind of interested in safety engineering and the way that humans interact with technology and kind of more of these socio-technical questions. But also at the same time, I was still working on applying machine learning to brain data for more practical applications, like systems that can kind of predict or anticipate a user's brain state and adapt accordingly. And then, and I was there for about 5 years. And due to so my wife is from Austria, and for that reason, we were kind of interested in coming back to Europe. And yeah, I found a job at Novartis in Basel, where it was kind of in this realm of digital medicine and trying to use connected devices to for clinical trials and also for treatment things. And they were just at the beginning of trying to apply machine learning, huge amounts of what they call real world evidence. And so, yeah, I worked in Basel for 3 or 4 years. And I didn't, the pharma, and I learned a ton, and I met a lot of really brilliant, amazing people. And scientifically, it was a great experience, but I would say the culture in big pharma is not super friendly, or, it's kind of stressful and hard, ruthless. And anyway, I was just really frustrated at Novartis. Not necessarily, well, because of the culture there, I ended up being frustrated scientifically and kind of intellectually. And then, I thought, we were like, well, let's move back to the States. And so I just cold applied to Twitter in a kind of data analyst role and a user researcher role. And, amazingly, I got an interview, and then did sort of Zoom interviews. This was, before the pandemic even. And then I came up, I landed the job and got here to Twitter. And then, and then I worked on studying misinformation at Twitter, and this was right in the wake of the 2016 election, and Twitter had just been kind of blindsided by Trump and the whole situation. So that was people were very interested in trying to figure out what's going on, and then Twitter. The culture at the management culture at Twitter was kind of interesting, and so all this time I had been very interested in kind of the philosophical roots of machine learning and studying and these things, and my interest had kind of broadened into these big socio-technical questions. And so eventually, I through a person I got to know at Twitter who had moved to Google, said like, why don't you try to come over to Google? It's kind of a more mature organization, and you have a lot more autonomy, and there's a lot of really cool research going on. And so that was about 3.5 years ago. I moved over to Google, and I've been there ever since, kind of working on AI and society, like social impact of artificial intelligence, and studying machine learning and things like that. So
very cool. I like a good winding story. I have a bit of a nonlinear career myself, where I've ended up here, thousands of kilometers away from home in the land of Switzerland. I want to dive into the topics in the book, but before I do that, maybe to give people a little bit more of a glimpse, it's interesting to hear about your journey and especially culture. I think we'll talk about that towards the end of things. But when you look at your role at Google, can you give us a little bit more of a practical day-to-day sense of how it fits into the bigger picture of what Google is doing to move forward machine learning and artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so I just recently moved over to Google Research. But prior to this, I started in the trust and safety organization at Google, which primarily fights abuse on Google and hate speech and misinformation, disinformation, and all kinds of these issues. And because I have this background in these heavily regulated industries like aerospace and like medicine or healthcare or pharma, they were interested in how to kind of apply risk management and hazard analysis and more rigorous types of documenting things on the development of these massive machine learning systems that are what they say are deployed into production. And so basically when I started at Google, this was before they had written their AI ethics principles that are you can Google AI principles, Google's AI ethics principles, and then I had a hand in that development of those things, and really a lot of the research we do is partly this practical question of when you're developing models and you're going to use them in situations that are kind of high stakes for people, or in some case, there's a lot of situations where it's very high stakes, like criminal risk assessments, and even in FinTech, I'm sure you're familiar with like anti-money laundering things, or like credit, risk assessments in the financial sense. And so when you of things that were typically done by human auditors or decision makers, you have to be extremely careful with the data that you collect, how you collect it, why do you collect it, and then the models that you build on this data, because the accuracy and the efficacy of the models, is very much tied to how good, quote unquote, your data is. And the practice in Silicon Valley has just been the default has just been you suck up just as much data as you possibly, as the systems are set up to just log endless amounts of data and build these giant models on them, and they can be extremely accurate. But what if you're measuring the wrong thing, or what if your sampling is really, really skewed, or your training data sets are not representative of the populations that you're actually using the systems on. And so a lot of my work is really it's both. I write academic papers that we publish in computer science venues on basically how to apply tools that have been partially developed in the finance industry for auditing systems to check that they are in accordance with certain ethical principles, or that they're not imposing sort of undue risks on society, basically. And how do you measure that, and how do you like mitigate that? And it's a huge challenge, just because at Google scale, it's and if, for example, systems are kind of reinforcing or entrenching systems of structural racism, or displaying bias, things like that, it can be hard to detect over a long time. And so we're trying to figure out ways of measuring that kind of impact. But then also you do have these, kind of one-off catastrophic failures of these systems that get huge media attention. And so we're kind of studying a lot of the ways, basically a lot of industries have figured out how to manage risk, like in aviation, like we all used to anyway, fly without really worrying too much about it, because the air transport system has been engineered. They've engineered a lot of the risks of flying away, and I think people take that for granted. But that was a decades-long effort with civil society, governments, manufacturers, airlines, and they all managed to kind of work in concert to make commercial air travel extremely safe. Like it's the risk of a hull failure or something is like 10 to the -9 per use hour or something. And so anyway, it's basically I would say my job now is really trying to distill and figure out how can we apply some of these tools to AI and machine learning in the tech industry, because it is we're in the West, and like it has been literally the Wild West out here, in terms of what you're doing with data, how you're doing it, and how you're developing things. And it's very much in contrast, to these other industries, safety industries. And I think we're trying to figure out like what the stakes are, and then what's feasible. And there are some unique things about the way machine learning works that aren't. It's difficult sort of sometimes to apply these tools from those industries to machine learning, because machine learning is not deterministic. It's probabilistic. So you're rather than specifying these are the rules of this software system, where you can check, like on a airplane avionics systems, you can check that each line of code is doing exactly what you want it to do, and you can verify that, and you can verify that it's being executed, and but with a machine learning system, the model is basically a broad outline of the type of research I do.
Really interesting, Andrew. It's funny, first of all, to hear that FinTech and other disciplines are coming back into influence the development in technology, especially at the scale that Google is operating at. Really interesting to hear how that's happening. It's funny because I have some family that work in criminal risk assessment, and also some others that work in airline management over the years. So I can appreciate the complexities of those two pursuits. Yeah, really fascinating. And also in crypto, I think we've seen a bit of that too, how compliance and the conservative aspects of the past that we want to hold on to that actually still have value is something that can be quite important. I also saw a really interesting example, the idea of training feedback loops, and the way that machine learning can watch processes sort of like a rock climber going up a wall and finding an optimal path, but then also how those feedback loops shift over time and retrain themselves, as well as the people participating in them. And yeah, whether it's criminal risk assessment or airlines, I'm sure Google has been doing some interesting stuff in that space. Can you tell us, where did you get the inspiration to write your book Beyond Zero and One? That's something that I really enjoyed diving into in the last month.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that the work is related in a way to what I do now, even though what I do now is, of course, more very, very practical and kind of in the now. But I do think that the sort of conceptual foundations of machine learning and AI are still very relevant, and philosophy is still very, very relevant to technology development and AI. And so that like I had mentioned before, I have a long-standing interest in philosophy of mind, and I've always been reading philosophy of mind, ever since I was probably 18 or something. And and so I'd been following the debates on consciousness, especially over the years, and been very interested in that. And then as AI kind of, and I'd always been interested in AI too from a philosophical perspective. And then as AI kind of exploded, around 2015, I guess, 2012. I guess 2012 was when, Jeff Hinton won the ImageNet challenge with the first deep learning network on that challenge. I mean, it wasn't the first deep learning network, but it was like the first one that, gained a kind of big amount of attention. And then suddenly Google was like, oh, what's this? This is really crazy. And then Nick Bostrom had written Superintelligence, and around that time there was this discussion of like, oh my God, AI, these existential risk, AI safety community kind of emerged, where it was like people worrying about like, what if an AI, starts to, all it wants to do is it figures out that making paper clips is like the optimal thing to do. So it kills humanity and sucks up all the natural resources just to make paper clips. Like, how do we prevent a paperclip maximizer from taking over the world? Those were kind of the problems that they were thinking about. And not to dismiss that work, like, but there's a lot of useful, I think, interesting approaches that come from them. But so I was following this debate and really interested in it. And then I was at the same time working at Novartis in Basel, and I had myself experimented with psychedelics when I was a grad student in Sweden, and I had read Albert Hoffman's book, LSD, My Problem Child, and it was a really weird situation where I realized, that Novartis, which is, I don't know if I'm sure your Swiss audience is very familiar with Novartis and the campus in Basel.
Yeah.
But it's this super, super modern, like amazing campus. And I realized like, oh, this it's so weird. This is where Albert Hoffman literally invented LSD, like, or synthesized it for the first time. And I found, it turned out that I had worked in the same building where his lab was, and I was just like, and I went around to all the people working there, like, did you know that this is where Albert Hoffman was working? And people were like, and it was really weird because a lot of the expats in Basel don't know that history at all, but most of the Swiss people were like, oh yeah, that's just like a normal part of their history. And then it turns out that there's an archive at Novartis in one of the buildings that housed Hoffman's, all of his original lab notes, all of it. And so one day on the tram, riding through Basel, I kind of like had this weird thought about like, I was in these two worlds, like pharmaceuticals and reading about AI and philosophy. And I was like, well, what if an AI could trip on acid? Like, because that thought was first kind of like, oh, that's a funny joke. But then I just was, and that was really the genesis of the book, was that a random spaced out thought on the tram in Basel, like, and so that began then the whole, where I sat down, I was like, oh, I'm gonna research this and try to do a book on this. So
it's a story I actually find really interesting. I've had a few of those moments myself where you're walking in the footsteps of people, and especially coming from Canada. I don't know if you felt this coming from the US, but there are less, as my dad used to say, ghosts in the street of Canada. The history doesn't go back as far. And in a country like Switzerland, you have such rich history.
Totally.
The steps of Hoffman are a little bit further from where I live here in Zurich, but not far. And it's funny, I had similar experiences when I was studying at Oxford. One night I realized I was in a pub that was a favorite hangout of the Inklings, the authors who wrote, The Lord of the Rings and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien and all these folks. Anyhow, another author who I enjoyed a lot, I can't remember if I mentioned this already, but I had read last year when I was taking a bit of a break, Aldous Huxley's Moksha, which also from another angle details the story of Albert Hoffman and the early days of LSD. And it was interesting to me because he sent the stuff and they were discussing in the book Huxley, the philosopher, and of course he's from a family of evolutionary thinkers. And the other really well-known name that was getting LSD was L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of the Scientology movement, who, if you think about incubating science fiction and new religion and different ideas like that, it's quite interesting. And then the last one was a British-Canadian psychiatrist, Humphrey Osmond, who was looking at schizophrenia and the criminality, sort of the dangerous aspect of hallucinations. So anyway, with those sort of weird things and the kind of intrigue of the topic behind us, what I found interesting about your book, and what I always think is really important, is what's the relevance. And I think when it comes to different ways of perceiving the world and how that relates into some deeper understanding of the science behind consciousness, that's what was really, quite inspiring to me. I hadn't dusted off my philosophy of the mind in about 10, 15 years, and a lot has changed with machine learning coming into the fold, right?
Yeah, yes, and I think what I was trying to tackle in the book was really there's been a lot of just debate over the years, like going back, all the way to the cybernetics movement in the 40s and 50s about the kind of like, basically, is the mind a machine? And the cyberneticians or whatever, who they really believed in that thesis that in order to kind of get out of the trap of dualism, you needed a naturalistic theory of mental phenomenon and of consciousness, even though the cybernetics people were not talking too much about consciousness back then, but they were like drawing on this this divide in philosophy about, well, the brain, the mind are the same thing, and the brain is a machine, and therefore we should study the human mind as a machine. And that's been a very strong metaphysical thesis throughout the history of AI, and trying to understand human consciousness and how that bears on this this ancient philosophical debate about is what we perceive reality. And typically philosophers and psychologists and it's like, no, the brain, there's reality, and then there's our perception of it, which is different from the reality. And then this kind of this idea, this what you used to call a soul or whatever, or like, I think most people, scientific people, probably don't. It varies, but like, don't subscribe. They, if you really press people, they say like, well, yeah, I'm a materialist or a physicalist. Like, there's no soul or whatever. So the problem became, how do you solve these mysteries of human experience? And how do you get an objective science of subjective experience? And that's been, the kind of axis around which a lot of these debates have gone. And then I think machine learning has, I think in the, in cognitive science, there was this, you had this, and I'm oversimplifying, but like, you had this kind of symbolic, which is sort of like Chomsky inspired work on the human mind is this kind of systems of symbolic manipulation. It's computational, but nonetheless, it's like these rules that we can, just by studying human language. And then what that became, then there were like statistically motivated people who were called the connectionists, back before 20 years ago. And they said, no, there's no, the brain is obviously learning these rules from the data. And, Chomsky's argument was always, we don't have enough time or enough data to learn the complexity of the things that we learn. And the connectionists were trying to show that, no, that you can learn these things, just by having these very simple neurons and then arrange them in a neural network. And, that's based loosely on how we think, real neurons work. And look, you can learn all this crazy stuff just by throwing data at these models. And the neural networks did not work really convincingly before I would say the 2010s. And then, like I mentioned, when I would say 2012-ish, around that time was when, people like Jeff Hinton, Jan LeCun, who had been doing neural networks, for 30 years, and kind of and really toiling in obscurity, and I think people don't appreciate how the AI winter, as they call it, was really where you could not use the phrase neural network and get published anywhere. But then there was a confluence of events about where computers got fast enough, big enough, and powerful enough that you could finally make models that were big enough and give them enough data to actually really become really accurate on these benchmark tests that had been developed, like ImageNet, that were used to as a contest, basically, like come up with an algorithm and see how accurate you can be on this massive data set of millions of images and classify. It just would, it could label a chair, it's kind of simple tasks, but object recognition is kind of still kind of the holy grail of computer vision. But I definitely think that resurgence of deep learning that was powered, not there's a lot of interesting like technical mathematical tweaks that have come out and innovations in terms of the models. But I mean, the fundamental idea is probably from the 50s. You know what I mean? Or like it's not like neural networks are new. It's just the fact that with this computing power, that you can get them to do useful stuff and really accurate stuff. And I think that the success of these models has really transformed the debate, like you were talking about the mind. And it's like, I think we've shifted back into like, oh yeah, the brain is just a deep learning network, and we just have to figure out what kind and how and the thing. But I definitely think that I'm not sure where I fall on this, but I'm definitely as a sort of humanist sympathizer or like a philosopher, I'm not. I don't, I think deep learning, as amazing as the things it does, is a very poor approximation or imitation or mimicry maybe of human learning. And I don't, I don't, and this is my like philosophical opinion. I don't think the brain is a neural network. It might use, it might like, you might be able to approximate like functions, but nonetheless, it's a model of what the brains are doing. And in the book, I was kind of trying to address some of these deep complexities about the brain that we just are barely scratching the surface of understanding. And I think I was just trying to point out that even these kind of niche, obscure areas of brain science that we barely understand play a huge role in our experience and the way we are as people. So, yeah.
Fascinating. And I know it takes a lot of explaining. I think Elon Musk calls it the bandwidth problem, right? We used to call it broken telephone and trying to express ourselves properly, but bandwidth problem sounds so much more 21st century. And thank you, because there is, as you say, a rich history, and there's a few people who stick out, but the one for me was always Rene Descartes, who put us into that sort of trap, as it was said. And I think a lot of the Enlightenment progress, whether it was folks like Wren sketching the brain and starting to get people to examine the taboo of anatomy and that side of things, or other philosophers, Searle talking about brains in vats and different challenges like that. I think a lot of people got a bit bored with the philosophical side of this. And as you say, when the actual practical science of applying machine learning got racing forward, it's interesting how that got people to think, oh, okay, we can just replace the brain. But what's fascinating to me is not only with consciousness, but also with like conception and, what Huxley was really interested in when he was taking LSD was the idea of enlightenment and death and how people experience that process. And yeah, it's quite fascinating how these things connect. At the end of the day, FinTech and biotech are not that far away. It's all life and perceptions and how we deal with them. I want to dive into the topic of hallucinations a bit, because that's really what the book is about and what you were trying to answer that day on the tram in Basel. Yeah, can you say more about that?
Yeah, so there, I think the interesting thing to me was in these debates about the brain sort of being a computer or like an AI, and again I'm addressing the philosophical idea of strong AI, where the project has always been to engineer an actual mind, and that was an explicit goal. And as we've progressed our understanding, of the brain, it's like we keep realizing how difficult that would actually be. And I think you can look back in the 60s. Marvin Minsky they were talking about computer vision, and he assigned computer vision as like a summer intern project for one of his students, and they were like, oh yeah, by in the summer we should be able to solve computer vision. And that I think a little bit, that hubris in AI is a little bit, it's hard to dislodge, especially as these things have become more and more successful for in a very kind of narrow sense of like make a lot of money and like do that kind of thing. So I think the hallucinatory aspect for me was driven by this and then this debate in cognitive science about whether our perceptions are what, like you have this idea of objective reality, which supposedly in a philosophical sense is what exists when they call it the mind independent world, like what is there when we're not observing it, which ostensibly is sort of what physics is trying to understand, although that gets complicated by quantum theory, where there's some interpretations of quantum theory where it's like, well, there's nothing there without us observing it. All there is observation, and we can predict what we're going to observe, but we can't say anything about what was there when we're not observing it. And so I think the hallucinatory part is interesting because there are psychologists and neuroscientists who would argue that our experience itself is a hallucination. It's just tuned to be useful for us, but we cannot. It bears no relation to any idea of some objective truth of the matter or fact of the matter. And there's a lot of examples, where perception goes wrong, of course, and it can be tied back to this idea that the what we experience as our world, our experience, is this kind of idea of a simulated model or something that the brain is generating that allows us to navigate the world. And there's a lot of models about like, its function is to minimize the amount of what they call free energy between the world and our experience. But then, I was kind of fascinated by this idea, and it I don't know if it originates, but it certainly this was kind of Kant's thesis too, about where what he called the Ding an sich, like we can never grasp the thing in itself. We only have our perceptions. And so in terms of AI, and again, I'm talking about this kind of strong AI idea, not really a machine learning model, but also people who do believe that ultimately a machine learning model can become conscious in the sense of our consciousness. What do hallucinations mean for that? Because the whole point of machine learning is to build predictively accurate models. Like if you give it enough data on a thing, the model should be super accurate and automatically so. And so if you're thinking in terms of the way that the human mind works according to these ideas, where your perception is built on a selective amount of information, like you were saying, the bandwidth problem, where it's like how many bits of information can our brains process, and there's various like different estimates, and who knows if even a bit is the right measure of that. But then this fundamental idea of that your brain is constructing your perceived reality out of these various bits, and somehow your brain is computing what you need to know, when you need to know it, and how you need to know it in order to presumably survive, or act in the world. And there's a little bit of a disconnect there with machine learning and modeling, just purely based on this idea of predictive accuracy, which to me is very different from what you'd say is it doesn't explain anything. It's not explanatory adequacy. It's like prediction and explanation are, I think, different sorts of projects. Or you can have an extremely accurate model that does a lot of great predictions, but it can still be the wrong model. And I think of things like the Ptolemaic model of the orbits of the planets, it's super accurate. You can still use it and predict like where Mars is going to be, but it's wrong. That's not actually the way the planets move. And we know, so there's, you can have very useful predictive things that are not the correct explanation scientifically. And so I was just in the book, I was just very interested in exploring the history of the science of hallucinations, and yeah, I was really trying to explore what that implies for attempts basically to use neuroscience inspired modeling, because as far as I can tell, that nobody's really in AI taken seriously hallucinations or tried to model, try to make an AI that hallucinates, because that sounds kind of like a crazy thing to do, unless you subscribe to this idea that, well, maybe our experience is itself a kind of hallucination, and so maybe it's actually a useful avenue, because they've used reinforcement learning and like all kinds of different theories and methods from neuroscience to like AlphaGo from DeepMind, and all. DeepMind is very very neuroscience inspired, by these things. But anyway, part of the motivation of the book was like, well, yeah, and like why can't you build a machine that hallucinates? And then the LSD connection is like, we know of this molecule that reliably induces altered states in humans, and it's relatively easy to get humans to hallucinate with this molecule. So if we understand a bit better, from a brain science point of view, what the LSD molecule is doing when you introduce it into the brain, you're kind of perturbing the way the normal brain functions, and so you can really understand a lot about quote unquote normal brain function by perturbing and that there's a few researchers in the UK, especially. I'm thinking of Robin Carhart Harris and David Nutt, who are really have been pushing the neuroscience of psychedelics and doing really cool studies of brain imaging on. Yeah, because now we have the technology to really and these tools are still crude, but they're much better than they used to be, and you can kind of peer into the brain in a sense, and get measurements of like how the activity is altered and in what regions, and then you can kind of interpret the results about. You can say, oh well, these networks shut down or stop talking to each other, and these other networks start talking to each other. And we know that in normal life, these networks, are functionally related to this and this and this, and then you can kind of correlate the subjective feeling of these changes that LSD induces in you to these situations in the brain state. So, I mean, I think there's a lot for AI to look at in this, but it's still a little bit. I don't know if it's taboo, and I think psychedelics are definitely becoming more acceptable, by far than when I was a kid. Like LSD was like the scariest, most terrifying drug imaginable, and I was literally terrified of it growing up. And I write a little bit about this in the book, like my own personal psychedelic journey or whatever. I think there's a bit of a hesitancy in kind of mainstream AI research and neuroscience about really looking closely at the implications of psychedelics for AI.
It's interesting to me. There's a couple of areas that seem somewhat related, and we'll talk about personal aspects of some of this stuff with your second book in just a moment. But whether it's hallucinations or dreams and simulations, it seems to me that there's a certain amount of creativity or experimentation that goes on in a lot of this stuff. And how would you distinguish hallucinations from, say, dreaming about something or simulating something in an AI environment?
Yeah, I mean, it's super. I mean, I think hallucinations, you're still awake. You're not sleeping, and that's where I would distinguish it from dreams. Although I think it's a matter of degrees, and all these states of arousal and consciousness are more on a spectrum than like where you say like they're distinct kinds of things, and even the auditory or visual hallucinations that a schizophrenic might experience are not fundamentally different from normal perception. The mechanisms and the processes are the same. It's just that somewhere in the schizophrenic case, that the ability to really check the hallucination against some other form of evidence or data is missing. So but as far as I understand, like people with who are suffering from schizophrenia, their experience is just as real as anyone's. You know what I mean? It's just that the it's a little bit, maybe something is wrong in the way that the generation process is the same. It's just somehow a little bit more disconnected from the incoming signals, and the way that the brain, these functions that the brain kind of checks, whether this is something to act on, or whether this is useful, or whether it's. But I would put dreams, hallucinations, normal. I hesitate to use the word normal, but like what we feel is a normal type of perception. I would say they're all on this kind of spectrum of experience, and like I think that, and then the simulation idea is a little difficult for me, because I know that overlaps with Musk's and Bostrom, and we're living in a simulation, and like we're the probability that human civilization, there are 10,000 future human civilizations, and like the probability that we're not living in a simulation is like 1 in a billion or billions or something. And in fact, with a philosopher friend of mine, we wrote a blog for Vice about why that's totally wrong, and that we're not living in a simulation. And I think the sense in which you say the brain is simulating things is quite different in the neuroscience sense than our entire reality is a simulation. But I think there's a lot of usefulness. Like, of course, scientists have used simulation forever. Where you're creating some kind of agents, and you put them in a certain type of environment, and you give each agent a certain set of rules or dynamic, and then you want to see how they interact and model the interactions, and then model how they interact with whatever environment you're in. And that's, you simulate things like that. But everyone understands that that's just kind of a very toy model. But getting back to these ideas of the, I'm not 100% sure about the simulation in the neuroscience sense. Like, I don't subscribe to the simulation hypothesis in the ultimate theory of reality sense. But I do think the brain is like on the fly, kind of creating models of itself and of the world, and kind of matching these internal models with external models. And I guess you can call that simulating things. But I think dreams, for example, are you're taking all of your experience throughout the day and your life sometimes too, and then while you're sleeping, it seems, I'm not a sleep expert, so but kind of my crude understanding is that it's like randomly shuffling a lot of memories so that they can be sort of consolidated, and you can integrate them better into your life, and so that's why sleep is extremely important, for your, and this for physical training too. Like, sleep is really where you recover. Like, if you're a runner or any involved in any kind of sport, like where you learn how to do the sport and where your body recovers is during sleep. And I mean, I think there's an interesting like when Lance Armstrong was going through his whole thing, talking about doping and cheating and performance enhancing. And then he always used to say, well, hey, naps are performance enhancing. Are we going to ban naps? And I think that's the role of dreaming and sleep is really key to that process.
Yeah, I like the one that the number one neuroenhancement is drinking water, and number two is adding lemon juice, and that's still scientifically, I think, proven. Although the iPhone is pretty handy as well. It's interesting to me. You've developed this concept of the Turing acid test, and I thought we would quickly touch on that, and then I wanted to try and bring things a bit together around the different levels of sort of adaptability that I think are kind of coming through in some of the themes of this book. Do you want to just quickly explain the acid Turing test and a few last words about Beyond 1 and 0?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I wrote that book, I think, like 6 years ago, so I have to I have to jog my memory. But um, yeah, I'm sure. I don't know. So the Turing test is the canonical test of machine intelligence. Even though Turing himself was his idea. It wasn't a test of machine intelligence or consciousness that people kind of interpret it as. Um, he was just saying we could get a machine to become indistinguishable from a human interlocutor. Like he was very like he's like you can't, even if a machine passes the Turing test, that doesn't say anything about intelligence or whatever. It just says that like we can conclude that it's displaying intelligent behavior. And there was that idea that like intelligence might be this unmeasurable quantity or aspect of things that you can't get at. But anyway, I thought it would be and again I'm way out in the philosophical speculation. However, I think I'm following a similar logic as a lot of writers on AI do, and this is like just a thought experiment about. So let's say that we have an AI that seems conscious and seems to be intelligent. It passes the Turing test. You can talk to it, and it says it's aware, and it's like for all like all things being equal, or for all we can tell, it's conscious in the way that we think of when we think of consciousness, and it's having an inner life, and it's experiencing things. And rather, so the Turing test then I thought could be, I thought of a way that you could then test that in a sense, although again it would be difficult objectively to verify. But if you could whatever that machine is made out of, and again this is also throwing open the discussion of silicon-based AI or some kind of weird bio hybrid thing or some other computing medium, that is not necessarily silicon based. But if we knew like we know the chemical formulation obviously of LSD, and if we could figure out a way, and I totally I totally avoid the discussion of how exactly would you introduce LSD to an artificial system, assuming that's possible or figure outable. Then I was like, a test of whether this machine is conscious. It was to give it LSD and then see if it, how does it react. And that's basically the idea behind the acid Turing test. And it's a little bit of a nod to, Ken Kesey and the Beats in San Francisco in the 60s, who would show up at these shows, and like Ken Kesey talks about, kind of stiff business people showing up, and he'd give them he called it the cup of stuff. And and the acid test was like, if you respond, and Ken Kesey said like, you can pass or fail the acid test, and if you take LSD and if you understand what it's about, then you've passed, but if you don't get it, then you failed. So it was kind of a nod to that idea, but I thought of like, this could be a way to probe the AI's consciousness would be to give it LSD. So
it sounds crazy a little bit at first, but I think posing impossible questions is something that's actually a really important thought exercise, and it tends to lead to inspiring some interesting things that come about years later. I want to start wrapping up Beyond Zero and One and give you a bit of a moment to talk about Autopilot, because that's a subject that a lot of people have been thinking about, especially with COVID on. But I see certain levels of connection between the two, because, for example, if you look at where psychedelics are actually starting to get pretty widespread attention now, it's actually in the wellness sort of space of alternative therapies for people who are dealing with anxiety, stress, let's just say how to accept and reframe their mind into new realities. I don't know if you saw the connection or if you have some other points you'd like to raise about the book, but do you want to say a few things about Autopilot and the personal side of these things?
Yeah. So that book, I wrote that book earlier, that was my first book. And from a personal perspective, that book was really inspired by my experience of going from an academic research lab, which is, intense and like high paced and high pressure in a sense. But it's a different type of pressure to moving to these industry research labs where you're not only supposed to do quote unquote cutting edge, scientific research, but you're also meant to, or you have to like kind of participate in corporate life and like corporate bureaucracy and process and, strange stuff. So after a while, I was a really big culture shock for me, going from NYU to Honeywell. And then I started to get kind of in trouble with with my manager, like, because I'm a typical kind of scatterbrained person, and so I was being recommended all these courses on time management, and I was, oh, you got to read these productivity books and how to be productive. And I was reading all this literature on time management, and I was just really, to be honest, I was like, this is all just such bullshit. And so I was kind of mad, that everyone took it so seriously, and like you had to take these courses and get certified and all this weird stuff. And I was like, this stuff is just not, because it used a lot of psychological concepts and like things that I thought were not right, and I just didn't like the paternalistic aspect of it, and I was trying to understand this weird way in which your entire identity and your sense of self-worth become tied to how well you manage your time and how productive you are. And I just really, thought that was a weird idea. And so and again, it was one of those situations where I think I was sitting in my cubicle at Honeywell and like working on some, data analysis or something, and then getting a reminder about like, oh, your time management session or something. And then I was like, wouldn't it be kind of funny to write an anti-time management book? And I was thinking of things like the 7 Habits of Highly, Ineffective People, or just, kind of a joke, like a parody of time management. But then, having come from this this field of neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience, whatever, the default mode network of the brain had recently, been getting a ton of attention in that field I was in, and I kind of connected the idea of like the resting state brain as being something important, and people were just starting to study it. This was probably 2009, 10 ish, and that had just started to gain traction in that field. And I thought like, oh, actually, there's a really serious scientific case to be made for not managing your time and quote unquote unproductive or useless. And there's a lot of anecdotal and empirical evidence that, people coming up with novel and innovative ideas literally cannot happen if your days are overscheduled and you're just like trying to hit all these arbitrary metrics, and you're like struggling all the time with these kind of minutia. And I'm not saying those things aren't important or that we should forget about. It needs to be balanced with a lot of idle time. If a goal or if something you think is important is innovation and novelty, and I kind of make the case, which stuff, and it's not, I'm drawing on other people's research, but I do think it still holds that these kind of novelty, the importance of novelty and innovation, if those are important things, like you absolutely need basically freedom and useless idle time to allow your brain to kind of make all these random connections that lead to these what people call aha moments, or because there's no way to control when those thoughts might arrive or how they might arrive. And I think we just know that the conditions that they tend to arrive in more are when you're in this kind of relaxed, spaced out, drowsy-ish state, like maybe in the shower, or like if you're, and I talk about Newton sitting in his garden, and I try to, basically do some historical fiction about like how he might, but he does say like, one of the people who visited him, quoted him and said like Newton was just like sitting in his garden on a nice afternoon when the idea of gravitation appeared to him. You know what I mean? And so I was imagining that he was in this kind of idle resting state, and then which actually, when your brain actually starts to, or different parts of your brain, start to really kick into high gear, and your brain is kind of able to synthesize all of these things that lead to like, where Newton, he had been struggling with all of these conflicting theories of motion and objects and things, and then at that moment he was able to kind of see, he was kind of basically able to resolve the connection or the contradiction that he was trying to struggle with theories of laws or laws of motion. And my argument, and again, this could be wrong, but my argument is that he was not at that moment actively trying to do that. He was just sitting in his garden relaxing when suddenly he was like, oh my God, I get it. It's this, and then he came up with his model. And I think there's a lot of examples like that in the history of ideas, in those conditions surrounding these kind of breakthrough ideas. And so, yeah, the book of Autopilot was, and I have a lot of regrets about the execution of the book and stuff, but that, I was young, etc. But I still think that the fundamental argument holds about like the way in which we've constructed our lives is actively harming innovation, and the way that we have constructed businesses to run, and even universities nowadays, is it's not conducive at all to having new ideas.
I'm glad you put it so clearly there, because I think that point comes across loud and clear. When you see corporate culture and how that can get stressed out, you realize that people don't come up with answers. They come up with fixes, and usually short-term ones that are based on the wrong kind of values and principles. Yeah. And it looks for a minute like things have gotten done, but after the quarterly report is done and you need to see the real perception of things, oddly enough, reality looks a little bit different than we were supposed to think when things were being rigidly controlled in a very linear kind of progression. It's fascinating to me to connect what we started saying very early on with your experience in culture. Also, the idea of the acid test, which you mentioned on an individual level, really put the suits to the test. But I think also really, looking at what we see in society nowadays, there is a real need for change, and big organizations are changing. We talk about how tech companies and others have pushed things to a point where companies are living shorter lifespans, and on an individual level, we all have to have a more dynamic career, as I think you and I have both experienced, living in different countries and working in different types of roles at different organizations. And to me, it really comes back to that idea of being resilient and flexible and dynamic. And not only how do we build that into our own systems and our own psychology, but how can we build that into our organizations and the technology that we're using to scale them. Really, really interesting stuff. It was interesting to me also, coming back to where some of these things come from. The military, not to sound negative, but this is a bit like an acid trip. It can start to get into funny territories and then hopefully get us back into a sunny pasture. I think a lot of people get scared of the idea of military, but when you look at where a lot of this stuff has come from, innovation tends to trickle down from solving big, scary problems. And it's interesting as I hear, different stories, whether it's about dummy tank platoons in the Second World War to trick people, or other examples of how we've used perception and insight to develop these innovations. It's interesting to me that, for example, on the LSD side, that's been something that's been developed as a treatment for people with PTSD to help them become more resilient and to refit into society. But then, on the other side, there's also games, and how the technology that went into building three-dimensional games and, Call of Duty and stuff like that. It was in talking with NVIDIA a few years ago that I really appreciated how that had moved so many things forward because of the three-dimensional processing that they enabled, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, NVIDIA, the GPU sort of revolution is one of the key enabling factors of deep learning and big data. Like I lost the name of who did this, but I mean, there was a paper where they were like, "Hey, you can run these massive neural networks on a GPU," and everyone went like, "Oh my God!" And that really sparked that way of applying neural networks to these massive data sets, and then these deep learning networks started to win all these competitions and get used. And now even, Google makes its own chips called TPUs, which are tensor processing units, which are optimized to run, TensorFlow, which is Google's it's open source AI platform. And so, yeah, I think that computational ability and breakthroughs in that is a really, it's an important, the enabling hardware and the way in which that's used is, I think it's a little bit underappreciated in just the kind of sense of like feat of engineering aspect to it. And how, that's a significant challenge to, get these things to work together and like string them together and to really maximize the speed and the efficiency with which they compute things. It's, yeah. And I mean, going back to your military point too, there's like, there was it sounds very conspiracy theory, but the CIA did have this program called MK Ultra, where they would give LSD to unsuspecting people, and to kind of see what it was. I would classify that as torture. If you get LSD and you don't know that you've taken it, you'd go crazy. And so, I think the trip would wear off, but then the damage from that happening, because you wouldn't have known what happened to you, would be probably very, very awful. And so, but they used to talk about, what if we like would spray enemy forces with LSD or give our own troops LSD, but eventually they concluded like, well, it's too unpredictable, like we don't know what would happen, like it might backfire. So they abandoned that. But and in terms of AI, the military interest and roots of AI is also kind of an under-discussed thing. But I mean, in Silicon Valley, it was funded by the military and the DoD. Back in the 50s and 60s, when Silicon Valley was being built out here, it was primarily the Pentagon, that was doing it, and it was for military purposes. And still, of course, DARPA has a lot of programs. And yeah, you raise a great, interesting point. Like the internet itself, the first ARP, it was called ARPANET, and that was the predecessor of DARPA. So the Advanced Research Projects Agency that later became the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They played a large role in building the internet and into, and then in GPS, all like all kinds of consumer tech that we take for granted today was initially funded by and intended for military use. So yeah, it's a, and that's even been referred to as the Pentagon system in American innovation.
I was going to say, I think that's what I meant about a bit like how passing the acid test, or at least understanding what passing the acid test is about, and the insights that one gains can be a bit helpful in this, because I think it can start to go a little bit sideways and seem scary when you think, oh, the military is behind Silicon Valley and the video game industry and a lot of pharmaceutical solutions. But I think when you look at it, it's really been for generally the idea of advancing and harmonizing things, not to go out and destroy everything. And over the course of history, we see how that's evolved and become less violent and hopefully become more ethical in the process. Certainly not perfect. But yeah, I want to finish talking about ethics in just a minute, but there's something that I thought was an interesting link, and I wonder what you would think about it. Also, something that I learned came out of insights from psychology in the Second World War was the idea that people on the spectrum, so for example, autism and Asperger's, were actually folks that were spared a lot of the eugenics work that happened in Germany. And it was interesting because they were proven to be very technically capable, and they could work in mathematics, physics, and also building a lot of this sort of stuff that went on. And it's interesting to me because when you think of some of the classic, profiles, whoever it may be in Silicon Valley, you can see how that particular type of profile within the gene pool and expression of human personalities can actually find a really great place to fit in and to contribute value. There are also some characteristics to that come, with being a little bit more internally focused and abstract and less connected to the real world. But again, I find that interesting because if you look at the world in more of a black and white sense, you could try to say good or bad. But if you start to appreciate things in more of a technicolor explosion, and appreciate that these different pieces have their different qualities and fit in different ways, it starts to become quite interesting. And I mean, not to sound really spacey, but when I think about how little we understand about nutrition and the different ways that our biology works here on Earth, and then we start talking about, what is it like in space, or what are these different conditions like? Yeah, it comes back to me in terms of the questions you're asking about with artificial intelligence, because we're building systems, they tend to be more programmatic, and yeah, those ethical types of questions would seem to be kind of the same sort of thing that you're asking at Google, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, it's really about the ability to not. I think what we're trying to, learn is the ability to take responsibility for this technology in a much more meaningful way. And I think there's an interesting tension between innovation and research and responsibility. And I think this, you can tie it, back to the development of the atom bomb, where, Einstein, of course, was initially very opposed to it, but eventually he was like, well, I think we have to do this because the consequences of the Nazis getting the bomb first are just unimaginable. So we're almost obliged to do it. And I think that kind of, but Einstein was very adamant about scientists have to take responsibility for what they create. And and I think this is we're going through this struggle at Google right now, where Google's creating all this kind of crazy AI, and it's really how we need to take responsibility for it, and we need to understand and anticipate the potential downsides and the risks. And because I think the practice in Silicon Valley in general has been, you build something, you launch it, on the internet or in the world, and if something goes wrong, you just fix it later, And I think there's a kind of a inflection point now where you're like, well, that's not okay anymore. that would be like an airplane manufacturer, or an airline, just trying out a new plane and seeing seeing how it works in reality before you do years and years of validation testing and safety testing, or with pharmaceuticals or drugs, and I even people talk about the rushed way in which the vaccines were developed, but I mean, the technology platform of the vaccines is it's not old, but it's been tested and validated. And so I think a lot of it, the ethical question is really the type of responsibility that technology developers feel and exercise. And it is really about studying the unintended consequences and trying to anticipate them and understand from whose perspective are you thinking, and it's not just the and it's tough because where that conflicts with profit motive, it's a difficult situation in industries like aviation and pharmaceuticals. Finance is an interesting question too, because it's like, why would anyone be ethical in finance? What but I mean, then you see things like the 2008 crash and all kinds of systemic risks that unethical behavior poses. And I think in aviation, it's clear that the profit motive and safety are basically one and the same, because if flying were more dangerous than it is, the industry would collapse. And I think everybody recognized, we have to make this as safe as possible, otherwise we're not going to have an industry. And I think the AI industry or tech industry is coming to that realization that people don't trust. The trust is very low, and people are paranoid and scared and don't understand it, and so we need a way to be transparent and open, and then also show there's a benefit to a lot of this technology, and that we are that that it's just anticipating the downsides and trying to prevent harm rather than reacting in these, kind of defensive, silly ways when harms are exposed. So I take a lot of inspiration from these. There's a field called like responsible innovation that really tries to study things like geoengineering or genetic engineering, and like how are risks to society measured and weighed when you're like, we could maybe geoengineer certain aspects of climate change, and help the situation. But in what ways could that go wrong? And that, I think that's really, especially in Silicon Valley, that you're seen as kind of a negative naysayer, or like, a curmudgeon. If instead of saying like, oh my God, this is amazing, and like, we got to launch this as soon as possible, like the people who say, wait a second, have you thought through what can go wrong? How can this be misused? How are you developing this? How are you showing that this is going to be safe? That kind of thinking is very new to the tech industry, and it's kind of a painful process right now. But I'm optimistic that it work, just because it has quote unquote worked in like aviation, and there's always, these are inherently super complex problems, and there's no sense in which you solve them. You just kind of get better. You get better at them, but it's not like you're ever going to be done with ethics, or you're going to be, you know what I mean? Like, and there's a little, the tension there in Silicon Valley, especially, is this, what people refer to as the solutionist mindset, where give me a solution, and that I can implement and program. And then we ethicists, or we people working on this, say like, no, there's no solution to this. It's hard. You have to think about it.
It's interesting, because I think to try and tie together a few things, what I really said earlier, I think is true. The idea that what's going on in the financial and technology innovation space, and how that's progressing, is quite similar to what we see in the biotech space. The idea that to a large extent, rules and money and other systems that we've developed to try and communicate between consciousness has been a solution for our early origins, and maybe our evolution from being more basic, kind of animals, and ones that might have fought more consistently with each other, or had more fight or flight type reflexes. And as we get more advanced, you hear people who've tried psychedelics, unlike myself. I'm thinking of Sting. There's a great Vice party story of Sting taking LSD, and he sees the grass moving like hair, and feels at one with the earth. And the idea that you don't have to fear other things and solve problems, and that everything will be okay, somehow seems to be something that human beings are trying to, reach a level collectively. And you talked about being transparent and open, and I thought I would circle back to Switzerland, which we share in common. It's not always known for being the most transparent and open. It's changed a lot because of the last financial crisis, but also because of the technology of being able to transport data across physical borders, and some of the restrictions that people think should be there, but humans surprise us, and they break through the system all the time. And what I've spent a lot of time talking about in the last 5 years is about how the pace of change is accelerating towards, let's call it, the singularity. But so much of culture here is about maintaining the best of the past and reliably delivering that. Do you see, like I do, there being an opportunity to bring those two worlds together, the move fast and break things culture of Silicon Valley with the conservative tradition of Switzerland?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point and question, and it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. And because what's super interesting is we're working at Novartis, which is a highly regulated. So you can imagine like the regulated business culture of pharmaceuticals, coupled with the Swiss culture of, like, I don't know what you want to call it, rigidity, or like rule following, and kind of very hierarchical and deferential, and a lot of face saving, and etiquette and things, and like defer, like everyone knows, there's a very prescribed way of behaving around superiors and stuff, but the super high quality, like reliable medicines that Novartis produces, are thanks to that type of culture. And this was acknowledged at Novartis by everyone, from Voss all the way down to everyone, that like the pace of innovation in pharmaceuticals is very slow. And there's a lot of studies about this, how we've barely tapped the space of potentially medicinal molecular entities. Like it's like a fraction of 1% of the things that might be amazingly useful drugs and the new molecular entities that are approved by the FDA is it just keeps falling. Like pharmaceutical companies are not making new medicines. they're kind of recycling other old ones and try, what I mean? And there's this tension of the regulatory burden, the expense of bringing a new drug to market, and this exploratory innovative type of research that might lead to new breakthroughs, like we had with insulin, or for example LSD, where Albert Hoffman was in this environment where he could like just try it on himself and see what happened, and that's how he discovered it. Do you know what I mean? And that's unthinkable today. That's unimaginable that like you'd have an organic chemist at Novartis like playing around with some molecules and being like, I'm just going to eat this and see what happens. And so, but there's good safety reasons for that type of thing. And like, I'm not, but then I worked in that environment for a long time. And then of course, coming to Google, which is it's 180 degrees. It's the opposite, it's like, just try whatever and see, you know what I mean? Because you're not, and it's different because you're not yet anyway, really experimenting directly on human beings. However, I think you could argue that in a sense we're experimenting on the world, on society with this technology. And so I've long thought about how do you safely and responsibly allow free innovation, and like, do you need sort of like Bell Labs, where they had the labs that were the people that were just like left alone and protected, and they could do whatever they wanted. And if they came up with a great idea, then I think you need some kind of model where you let scientists, and there's even this discussion around AI, like, should we create these kind of sandbox situations that are like, sealed off from the world, and we experiment with the AI and see, you know what I mean, and try to see if it's safe before we let it out, into the world, and like that. But then, like, who knows, maybe the AI deceived us and tricked us, into that. It had good intentions. I don't really buy that. But I think from an engineering perspective, you might be able to do that where it's really this, I think that's a really hard tension. And it's something I really struggle with, is like, I do believe that we need totally free inquiry and open exploration of the science and the research, and to promote innovate, like we need new breakthrough ideas, more than ever. At the same time, the stakes are too high to do that, to figure things out in this iterative, like, and again, it would just be like trying out a drug on a population before you've gone through animal safety, before you've made sure that this is dangerous than the disease you're trying to treat, and I think if anyone could crack that safety, responsibility, fairness, ethical thing with this pure innovation approach, it would be that would itself, I think, would be kind of a breakthrough, where you could get fast innovation, but in a responsible and safe way. Because if you look at the history of medicine and aviation, just as examples, and you could throw finance in there too, it's only through these catastrophic failures that we learn how to be safer. And how do we avoid like having to go through some AI catastrophe to learn how to create this? I feel like we should be able to learn from these histories, in this way. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I want to be respectful of your time, especially as you're mentioning there's some tension you're trying to resolve with some of these questions. A nice relaxing day would probably help on that, as we were saying earlier.
Sure.
Andrew, we covered a lot of ground. Are there any final thoughts, especially keeping in mind the FinTech audience, that you'd like to end on?
Oh boy, I think what's fascinating to me about FinTech, and I'm not a finance person. I'm not, but I have tried to study some of it. I'm super fascinated by this notion of systemic risk, and I'm really fascinated by for example, by the '08 crash, and how the combination of, I guess you'd call it, unscrupulous or unethical behavior by investors contributed to this systemic risk, where each actor is, ostensibly acting rationally and but there's these structures and these systems in which they're behaving that constrain their behavior or encourage other types of behavior, which led to the entire system being put at risk. And I'm fascinated by, because I think after that crash, you had what's fascinating to me. So for example, and I bring up auditing because we're trying to understand how financial audits work and use them kind of on AI. Like, how would you audit an AI system? Like in the same way you might audit, like UBS or something. And there's fascinating cases where like KPMG audited like Washington Mutual like a week before the crash, and they were like, "You guys look great, everything's looking good." And then a week later, they were gone. They just imploded because everyone was imploding. And so then they were actually sued, I think, by the remnants of Washington Mutual, sued KPMG and were like, that's totally negligent. Like, how did you miss that the whole system was about to collapse? And then they were like, well, these kinds of things are inherently unpredictable. And I find that so interesting to be like, well, wait, like, isn't the whole point of finance to be predicting, these models are like predicting what things are doing. And I find the kind of the aggregation of all these agents, together, and how do you like study those kinds of huge, like global scale, like systemic risk basically is super interesting to me. And we're trying to study that in terms of like AI systems basically. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I'm interested in.
Totally. And again, as I said earlier, it's really actually a nice surprise in the discussion today to hear that that the financial world and some of its learnings are going back to influence what Google is doing on the cutting edge of AI. Because if I haven't said it, we're very inspired and follow everything Google's been doing. Love to hear about the insights and some of the more controversial or contrarian thoughts that are helping to move minds there and keep them moving forward. And I'm looking forward to hearing lots more in the future. So thank you again, Andrew, for joining us today. When are you writing your next book? Anything in the works right now?
That's a good question. I mostly write academic papers, or like papers now, like research papers. But I mean, it'll be a few years, I think. I have kids and like work, and it's difficult, but I'd love to. Yeah.
Well, that all sounds great. And again, thank you, Andrew. Stay on the line. I want to catch up with you afterwards. But until next time, thank you again for joining us.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.